Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 36, Part 2. "It really," said Traddles, suddenly taking a letter out of his pocket and giving it to me, "put Mr. Micawber quite out of my head." The letter, Mr. Micawber never missed any possible opportunity of writing a letter, was addressed to me, "By the kindness of T. Traddles, Esquire, of the Inner Temple." It ran thus: "My dear Copperfield, you may possibly not be unprepared to receive the intimation that something has turned up. I may have mentioned to you on a former occasion that I was in expectation of such an event. I am about to establish myself in one of the provincial towns of our favoured island, where the society may be described as a happy admixture of the agricultural and the clerical, in immediate connection with one of the learned professions. Mrs. Micawber and our offspring will accompany me. Our ashes, at a future period, will probably be found commingled in the cemetery, attached to a venerable pile for which the spot to which I refer has acquired a reputation, shall I say, from China to Peru. In bidding adieu to the modern Babylon, where we have undergone many vicissitudes, I trust not ignobly, Mrs. Micawber and myself cannot disguise from our minds that we part, it may be for years, and it may be forever, with an individual linked by strong associations to the altar of our domestic life. If, on the eve of such a departure, you will accompany our mutual friend, Mr. Thomas Traddles, to our present abode, and there reciprocate the wishes natural to the occasion, you will confer a boon on one who is ever yours, Wilkins Micawber." I was glad to find that Mr. Micawbins had got rid of his dust and ashes, and that something really had turned up at last. Learning from Traddles that the invitation referred to the evening then wearing away, I expressed my readiness to do honour to it, and we went off together to the lodging which Mr. Micawber occupied as Mr. Mortimer, and which was situated near the top of the Gray's Inn Road. The resources of this lodging were so limited that we found the twins, now some 8 or 9 years old, reposing in a turn-up bedstead in the family sitting-room, where Mr. Micawber had prepared, in a wash-hand-stand jug, what he called a brew, of the agreeable beverage for which he was famous. I had the pleasure on this occasion of renewing the acquaintance of Master Micawber, whom I found a promising boy of about 12 or 13, very subject to that restlessness of limb which is not an unfrequent phenomenon in youths of his age. I also became once more known to his sister, Miss Micawber, in whom, as Mr. Micawber told us, her mother renewed her youth like the phoenix. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "yourself and Mr. Traddles find us on the brink of migration, and will excuse any little discomforts incidental to that position." Glancing round as I made a suitable reply, I observed that the family effects were already packed, and that the amount of luggage was by no means overwhelming. I congratulated Mrs. Micawber on the approaching change. "My dear Mr. Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "of your friendly interest in all our affairs I am well assured. My family may consider it banishment if they please, but I am a wife and mother, and I will never desert Mr. Micawber." Traddles, appealed to by Mrs. Micawber's eye, feeling acquiesced. "That," said Mrs. Micawber, "that, at least, is my view, my dear Mr. Copperfield and Mr. Traddles, of the obligation which I took upon myself when I repeated the irrevocable words, "I, Emma, take thee, Wilkins." I read the service over with a flat candle on the previous night, and the conclusion I derived from it was that I never could desert Mr. Micawber. And, said Mrs. Micawber, though it is possible I may be mistaken in my view of the ceremony, I never will. My dear, said Micawber, a little impatiently, I am not conscious that you are expected to do anything of the sort. I am aware, my dear, Mr. Copperfield, pursued Mrs. Micawber, that I am now about to cast my lot among strangers, and I am also aware that the various members of my family, to whom Mr. Micawber has written in the most gentlemanly terms announcing that fact, have not taken the least notice of Mr. Micawber's communication. Indeed, I may be superstitious, said Mrs. Micawber, but it appears to me that Mr. Micawber is destined never to receive any answers whatsoever to the great majority of the communications he writes. I may augur from the silence of my family that they object to the resolution I have taken, but I should not allow myself to be swerved from the path of duty, Mr. Copperfield, even by my papa and mamma, were they still living. I expressed my opinion that this was going in the right direction. It may be a sacrifice, said Mrs. Micawber, to immure oneself in a cathedral town, but surely, Mr. Copperfield, if it is a sacrifice in me, it is much more of a sacrifice in a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities. Oh, you are going to a cathedral town, said I. Mr. Micawber, who had been helping us all out of the wash-hand-stand jug, replied, to Canterbury. In fact, my dear Copperfield, I have entered into arrangements by virtue of which I stand pledged and contracted to our friend Heap, to assist and serve him in the capacity of, and to be, his confidential clerk. I stared at Mr. Micawber, who greatly enjoyed my surprise. I am bound to state to you, he said with an official air, that the business habits and the prudent suggestions of Mrs. Micawber have in a great measure conduced to this result. The gauntlet to which Mrs. Micawber referred upon a former occasion being thrown down in the form of an advertisement was taken up by my friend Heap, and led to a mutual recognition. Of my friend Heap, said Mr. Micawber, who is a man of remarkable shrewdness, I desire to speak with all possible respect. My friend Heap has not fixed the positive remuneration at too high a figure, but he has made a great deal in the way of extrication from the pressure of pecuniary difficulties contingent on the value of my services, and on the value of those services I pin my faith, such address and intelligence as I chance to possess, said Mr. Micawber, boastfully disparaging himself with the old genteel air, will be devoted to my friend Heap's service. I have already some acquaintance with the law, as a defendant in civil process, and I shall immediately apply myself to the commentaries of one of the most eminent and remarkable of our English jurists. I believe it is unnecessary to add that I allude to Mr. Justice Blackstone. These observations, and indeed the greater part of the observations made that evening, were interrupted by Mrs. Micawber's discovering that Master Micawber was sitting on his boots, or holding his head on with both arms as if he felt it loose, or accidentally kicking Traddles under the table, or shuffling his feet over one another and producing them at distances from himself apparently outrageous to nature, or lying sideways with his hair among the wine-glasses, or developing his restlessness of limb in some other form incompatible with the general interests of society. And, by Master Micawber's receiving those discoveries in a resentful spirit. I sat all the while amazed by Mr. Micawber's disclosure and wondering what it meant, until Mrs. Micawber resumed the thread of the discourse and claimed my attention. "What I particularly request Mr. Micawber to be careful of is," said Mrs. Micawber, "that he does not, my dear Mr. Copperfield, in applying himself to this subordinate branch of the law, place it out of his power to rise, ultimately, to the top of the tree. I am convinced that Mr. Micawber, giving his mind to a profession so adapted to his fertile resources and his flow of language, must distinguish himself. Now, for example, Mr. Traddles," said Mrs. Micawber, assuming a profound air, "a judge, or even, say, a chancellor. Does an individual place himself beyond the pale of those preferments by entering on such an office as Mr. Micawber has accepted?" "My dear," observed Mr. Micawber, but glancing inquisitively at Traddles too, "we have time enough before us for the consideration of those questions." "Micawber," she returned, "no. Your mistake in life is that you do not look far forward enough. You are bound, in justice to your family, if not to yourself, to take in at a comprehensive glance the extremest point on the horizon to which your abilities may lead you." Mr. Micawber coughed and drank his punch with an air of exceeding satisfaction, still glancing at Traddles as if he desired to have his opinion. "Why, the plain state of the case, Mrs. Micawber," said Traddles, mildly breaking the truth to her. "I mean the real prosaic fact, you know." "Just so," said Mrs. Micawber. "My dear Mr. Traddles, I wish to be as prosaic and literal as possible on a subject of such importance." "Is," said Traddles, "that this branch of the law, even if Mr. Micawber were a regular solicitor—" "Exactly so," returned Mrs. Micawber. "Wilkins, you're squinting, and will not be able to get your eyes back." "Has nothing," pursued Traddles, "to do with that. Only a barrister is eligible for such preferments, and Mr. Micawber would not be a barrister without being entered at an Inn of Court as a student for 5 years." "Do I follow you?" said Mrs. Micawber with her most affable air of business. "Do I understand, my dear Mr. Traddles, that at the expiration of that period Mr. Micawber would be eligible as a judge or chancellor?" "He would be eligible," returned Traddles, with a strong emphasis on that word. "Thank you," said Mrs. Micawber. "That is quite sufficient. If such is the case, and Mr. Micawber forfeits no privilege by entering on these duties, my anxiety is set to rest. I speak," said Mrs. Micawber, "as a female, necessarily. But I have always been of opinion that Mr. Micawber possesses what I have heard my papa call, when I lived at home, the judicial mind. And I hope Mr. Micawber is now entering on a field where that mind will develop itself and take a commanding station." I quite believe that Mr. Micawber saw himself in his judicial mind's eye on the woolsack. He passed his hand complacently over his bald head and said with ostentatious resignation, "My dear, we will not anticipate the decrees of fortune. If I am reserved to wear a wig, I am at least prepared externally," in allusion to his baldness, "for that distinction. I do not, said Mr. Micawber, regret my hair, and I may have been deprived of it for a specific purpose. I cannot say. It is my intention, my dear Copperfield, to educate my son for the church. I will not deny that I should be happy on his account to attain to eminence. For the church, said I, still pondering between whiles on Uriah Heep. Yes, said Mr. Micawber. He has a remarkable head voice and will commence as a chorister. Our residence at Canterbury and our local connection will no doubt enable him to take advantage of any vacancy that may arise in the cathedral corps. On looking at Master Micawber again, I saw that he had a certain expression of face, as if his voice were behind his eyebrows, where it presently appeared to be on his singing us, as an alternative between that and bed, the woodpecker tapping. After many compliments on this performance, we fell into some general conversation, and as I was too full of my desperate intentions to keep my altered circumstances to myself, I made them known to Mr. and Mrs. Micawber. I cannot express how extremely delighted they both were by the idea of my aunt's being in difficulties, and how comfortable and friendly it made them. When we were nearly come to the last round of the punch, I addressed myself to Traddles and reminded him that we must not separate without wishing our friends health, happiness, and success in their new career. I begged Mr. Micawber to fill us bumpers and proposed the toast in due form, shaking hands with him across the table and kissing Mrs. Micawber to commemorate that eventful occasion. Traddles imitated me in the first particular, but did not consider himself a sufficiently old friend to venture on the second. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, rising with one of his thumbs in each of his waistcoat pockets, "the companion of my youth, if I may be allowed the expression, and my esteemed friend Traddles, if I may be permitted to call him so, will allow me, on the part of Mrs. Micawber, myself, and our offspring, to thank them in the warmest and most uncompromising terms for their good wishes. It may be expected that on the eve of a migration which will consign us to a perfectly new existence," Mr. Micawber spoke as if they were going 500,000 miles, "I should offer a few valedictory remarks to two such friends as I see before me. But all that I have to say in this way I have said. Whatever station in society I may attain through the medium of the learned profession of which I am about to become an unworthy member, I shall endeavour not to disgrace, and Mrs. Micawber will be safe to adorn. Under the temporary pressure of pecuniary liabilities contracted with a view to their immediate liquidation, but remaining unliquidated through a combination of circumstances, I have been under the necessity of assuming a garb from which my natural instincts recoil. I allude to spectacles. And possessing myself of a cognomen to which I can establish no legitimate pretensions. All I have to say on that score is that the cloud has passed from the dreary scene, and the god of day is once more high upon the mountain-top. On Monday next, on the arrival of the 4 o'clock afternoon coach at Canterbury, my foot will be on my native heath. My name, Micawber." Mr. Micawber resumed his seat on the close of these remarks and drank 2 glasses of punch in grave succession. He then said with much solemnity, "One more thing I have to do before this separation is complete, and that is to perform an act of justice. My friend, Mr. Thomas Traddles, has on 2 several occasions put his name if I may use a common expression, to bills of exchange for my accommodation. On the first occasion, Mr. Traddles was left, let me say, in short, in the lurch. The fulfilment of the second has not yet arrived. The amount of the first obligation, here Mr. Micawber carefully referred to papers, was, I believe, 2349.5. Of the second, according to my entry of that transaction, 1862. These sums united make a total, if my calculation is correct, amounting to 4110.11.5. My friend Copperfield will perhaps do me the favour to check that total. I did so, and found it correct. To leave this metropolis, said Mr. Micawber, and my friend Mr. Thomas Traddles, without acquitting myself of the pecuniary part of this obligation, would weigh upon my mind to an insupportable extent. I have therefore prepared for my friend Mr. Thomas Traddles, and I now hold in my hand a document which accomplishes the desired object. I beg to hand it to my friend Mr. Thomas Traddles, my IOU for 4110.11.5, and I am happy to recover my moral dignity, and to know that I can once more walk erect before my fellow men. With this introduction, which greatly affected him, Mr. Micawber placed his IOU in the hands of Traddles and said he wished him well in every relation of life. I am persuaded not only that this was quite the same to Mr. Micawber as paying the money, but that Traddles himself hardly knew the difference until he'd had time to think about it. Mr. Micawber walked so erect before his fellow man on the strength of this virtuous action that his chest looked half as broad again when he lighted us downstairs. We parted with great heartiness on both sides, and when I'd seen Traddles to his own door and was going home alone, I thought, among the other odd and contradictory things I mused upon, that, slippery as Mr. Micawber was, I was probably indebted to some compassionate recollection he retained of me as his boy lodger for never having been asked by him for money. I certainly should not have had the moral courage to refuse it, and I have no doubt he knew that, to his credit be it written, quite as well as I did. Thank you all so much for joining me. Same time tomorrow, 5 Pacific, at Fireside Reading on Instagram Live for the next chapter of David Copperfield. All the chapters of every book that we've read uploaded to the YouTube channel Fireside Reading. Please check it out. And until I see you all again tomorrow, please stay very well. Good night.